Good morning and welcome. Thank you all so much for being here for our Constitution Day Convocation. As President Holloman mentioned in his President's Convocation a couple of weeks ago, we have pocket constitutions for you on that back table. If you are interested, we have them in majority English but also in Spanish, if that's useful to anyone. I have also been told that this functions as a pocket constitution, but those are cool. I'm a political scientist, so yeah, I think that's cool. All right, y'all. This morning, we are fortunate to listen to Dr. Paul Finkelman talk to us on free speech and civil discourse, due in part to the excellent efforts of our legal studies coordinator, Channing Hall. Thank you very much. Also support of, also thanks to the support of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. We are grateful to have their support. So, Paul Finkelman is the author of more than 100 law review articles, 100 other scholarly articles and book chapters, and the author or editor of more than 50 books. He has been cited in 6 U.S. Supreme Court decisions and many decisions in other federal and state courts. He has appeared on PBS, C-SPAN, NBC, Sunday Morning on CBS, and was recently filmed for a forthcoming movie about Thomas Jefferson. Many of his public lectures are on YouTube or available on C-SPAN. He has published op-eds, reviews, and essays in, among others, the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Washington Monthly, Huffington Post, NewYorkTimes.com, the Los Angeles Review of Books, TheRoot.com, USA Today, and the Baltimore Sun. He is a specialist in American legal history, constitutional law, law and religion, civil rights and race relations, civil liberties, American constitutional history, the American Civil War. Oh, there's so much. And legal issues surrounding baseball. He has lectured on human trafficking and on human rights issues at the United Nations, throughout the United States, and in more than a dozen other countries. In 2014, he was ranked as the 5th most cited legal historian in American legal scholarship in Brian Leder's Scholarly Impact Survey. He is ranked in the top 10% of all scholars for downloads on SSRN. He was an expert witness in a number of cases, including the lawsuit over the ownership of Barry Bonds' 73rd home run ball, and in the famous Alabama 10 Commandments monument case. In 2017, he held the Fulbright Chair in Human Rights and Social Justice at the University of Ottawa. Y'all, we are extremely grateful for the opportunity to welcome Dr. Paul Finkelman.
Can you grab one of those constitutions and bring it to me, Monica?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, this is kind of like a small class. It's not a big lecture. And that means that while I'm talking, if any of you have a question, raise your hand, okay? I probably won't stop in mid-sentence because I'll forget what I was saying. So I'll finish the sentence, but I'll nod or I'll point a finger or something. That means I recognize that your hand is up and I'm going to call on you in a second. And I welcome questions because this should be an interactive educational opportunity, not some boring guy giving a boring talk, reading his notes, and you all falling asleep, okay? So let's all interact and learn together. So the topic today is how do we deal with free speech and public discourse in what I would call a great age of anxiety. And we have watched riots on campus last spring. We are all familiar with a political moment where there seems to be no political dialogue. That is, people who are supporting Vice President Harris talk to each other. People who are supporting the former indicted President of the United States who is trying to get back in office talk to each other. And there are 12 people in the middle that everybody's talking at. And that seems to be our political discourse. It has not always been this way, but there are times when it has been this way and worse. And so when we think about free speech, we need to understand that while our moment is most relevant to us because it is our moment and we are living through it, it's always useful to kind of get a grip and stand back and say, well, yes, but it's not the first time we've had moments like this, and history does matter. Understanding the evolution of current events does matter. If you are listening to the political dialogue, it is useful to be able to distinguish between political rhetoric and actual facts, And, I will only give one example because I watched the debate the other day, and Mr. Trump said that this is the worst inflation in the history of the United States. Well, clearly he failed American history. He doesn't remember when there was 22% inflation in the 1970s and early 1980s. He doesn't remember when banks stopped giving mortgages because states had a cap on how much interest you could charge, and inflation was way over that. And when he talked about unemployment, worst unemployment in the history, well, you should all take a course with your professor on the Great Depression, when 1/3 of the United States was out of work. So it is useful when you think about free speech to understand that people can say things, and they are free to say things, although I will talk about things you're not free to say. But just because they say it doesn't mean it's true. It's kind of like, the people who say, well, I saw it on the internet, so it must be true. If I believed everything that I saw on the internet, I would know that there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars waiting for me in some foreign bank account. If only I would send my banking information and social security number to the people who are just desperately trying to give me all this money. I don't believe it. Now, some of you may believe it. I hope not. Okay? So let's start with the creation of the American Constitution in 1787, and then I'm going to move backwards from that, and then I'm going to move forwards from that, okay? So Constitution is written in the summer of 1787, and it is a remarkable, unique moment in world history. And this is one of these moments when you can truly say, nothing like this has ever happened before. You have 13 political entities who just a few years before this, 11 years before this, were colonies of the British Empire. And now, actually 12 years, 1775 they're colonies, 1787 they are now free independent states. They have a government. They've created a government under something called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, among other things, say they have created a perpetual union. This, of course, will be important later on in 1860 and 61 when a number of states, including Louisiana, decide they don't want to be in the perpetual union anymore. And the then sitting president, Abraham Lincoln, says, no, we all agreed we're in a perpetual union. You don't have a right to leave unless we collectively vote to have you leave, which, by the way, could have happened. But the people in South Carolina didn't want to wait, and so they started firing cannon against something which we would call, in those days as today, the United States Army. And so, by the way, when you think of what the Civil War is all about, it's not a war between the rebels and the Yankees. It is not a war between the Southerners and the Northerners. It is a war between 11 former states and the United States of America. And when you talk about the army that ultimately wins that war, it is the United States Army. It is not some made-up name. And that's often used because people don't like to think about the fact that their Confederate ancestors were shooting at United States Army soldiers, because that's a little bit disconnected to what they think they're all about. Anyways, and by the way, it is worth remembering that both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were born in slave states. They were born really about 50 miles from each other in Kentucky. Lincoln's father went north to the Free State of Indiana. Jefferson Davis' father went south to Mississippi. So in any event, you have this union, this perpetual union, but the Articles of Confederation don't work very well. And one of the reasons they don't work very well is because it is not a very strong national government. And that's because nobody's ever created a government like this. I mean, if you look at the history of Europe, if you take a course on the evolution of Europe, European nations develop over time. European nations evolve. Nobody says one day, hey, we're creating a nation. It's a very interesting and unique moment. And so delegates from 11 of the states meet in Philadelphia in 1787. Later, one of the missing states, New Hampshire, finally gets around to sending its delegates. And Rhode Island never sends its delegates, so you get only delegates from 12 states. They write a constitution. It's a constitution that is full of compromises. And tonight, there will be a movie shown, which I helped create. I'm actually the fourth person in the movie credits. So if I get to be in 2 more movies at that level, I get to vote on the Academy Awards. I can't wait. Probably will never happen, but it's cool to fantasize about that, right? But then I think I'd also have to join like the Screen Actors Guild or something. But in any event, you'll get a movie about the Electoral College, which is all about compromise, all about figuring out how to balance different issues. And there are lots of issues. One of the key issues is slavery. On the very first day of the convention, there's a debate over slavery. At the end of the convention, there's a debate over slavery, and it happens all the time. And by the way, I'm sure that almost none of this was ever taught to you in high school, because American schools don't like to talk about the bad stuff, and the complicated stuff and the difficult stuff. And sadly, many teachers aren't equipped to talk about it, but it's there. And if anybody's interested, you can go to your library and you can get the first 2 volumes of a 4-volume set called The Records of the Federal Convention of 1787. And you can just read the debates. And it's there from day one, and it's there all the time, over and over again, until the end. Okay, they write a constitution. One of the things the Constitution does not do is to have what we call the First Amendment. First Amendment is added to the Constitution in, there's all sorts of weird technology up here that keeps falling down and trying to attack me. So the First Amendment is added in 1791 when it's ratified. I'm going to read it for you. I've given tons of lectures on this. I'm sure I've memorized the First Amendment, but it's always worth reading it. There's a famous moment when Justice Hugo Black, who was one of the great justices of American constitutional history. He was from Alabama. He was a strong, strong supporter of free speech. He was being interviewed on TV, and the interviewer said, so tell me about the First Amendment. He said, well, let's look at it. And he opens up his pocket constitution, and the interviewer on national TV says, Justice Black, you've written hundreds of opinions on the First Amendment. Why do you have to read it? And he said, because every time you read it, you might see something new that you didn't catch last time. So the amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. There's a lot of content in here. So one of the pieces of the content is the right of the people to peaceably assemble to petition the government. That doesn't mean you can charge into the House of Representatives and try to prevent the House of Representatives from doing its duty to certify a presidential election, as took place on January 6th, 2021. That's not peaceable. Nor does it mean that you can block the entrance to a building on a college campus to protest whatever it is that you choose to protest and prevent other people from getting into that building, because that is also not peaceable. Now, note that the first word is Congress shall make no law. Now, originally, the First Amendment only applied as a limitation on the United States Congress, so that the states were free to pass whatever laws they want. The states were free to abridge freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And in fact, at the time that this is written, there are still a number of states that have an official church. And there are a number of states that have language in their laws and their constitutions, which, if not favoring a particular denomination, nevertheless favor a general religion. So, for example, the state of New Jersey says that the official religion of New Jersey is Protestant Christianity. This is a Methodist school. You'd qualify. The Baptists would qualify. The Congregationalists would qualify. The 34% of the people in Louisiana who are Roman Catholics would not qualify, and therefore could not hold public office. And the very tiny percentage of people who are Jewish would not qualify and could not hold public office. So there's a distinction in the beginning between what the federal government can do and what the states can do. After the Civil War, the United States adds 3 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Civil War Amendments. The 13th prohibits slavery. The 14th does many, many things. It's a very long amendment. But one of the things it does is to declare that no state shall deny anybody the privileges and immunities of an American citizen, and no state shall make any law which deprives any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny anyone the equal protection of the laws. The Supreme Court has properly ruled, properly understood this to mean that a state cannot deny you the liberty that you have as an American citizen under the First Amendment. So now, when we read the First Amendment, although the language says Congress shall make no law, what we really need to read it as is government may make no law. You can contemplate whether the Louisiana legislature, in its infinite wisdom, has in fact violated the Constitution by declaring that every classroom in every state institution of education, from kindergarten to medical school or law school, has to have a copy of the 10 Commandments on the wall in every classroom, whether that violates the Constitution, since they are clearly establishing a religion. It's also, of course, worth noting for any of you who take faith and religion seriously that various Protestant faiths have different versions of the 10 Commandments. Catholics have a different version than Protestants. Jews have a different version than Catholics and Protestants. Lutherans, who are Protestants, have a different version than all other Protestants. And so if you go read the statute, the first thing you'll notice is they've said what the 10 Commandments are, and they've listed 12 commandments, which suggests perhaps that the people in the Louisiana legislature failed first grade math as well. Who knows? So these are issues that we encounter when we think about the First Amendment. Now, what's interesting is the First Amendment, which is the center of free speech, begins not with speech, rather, but religion, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Why do they start with religion? Because historically, the great free speech issues in Western history, in Europe and in the United States, the great free speech issues were almost always about religion. in the more recent history of Europe, in the 1600s, there's something called the 30 Years' War, which is basically, and I say this with some trepidation because we have your European history professor here to correct me, but basically what the 30 Years' War is about is Protestants killing Catholics to send them to heaven properly, and Catholics killing Protestants to send them to heaven properly. And you know, that's hardly a good way to practice religion. I think most people would agree. So the First Amendment says you can't, government has no business getting involved in people's private faith, in people's religious practice, in what you believe, what you think, what's near and dear to you. The government has no business in telling you how to behave in that regard. That, in theory, is supposed to limit and end religious discrimination in the United States. Of course, we know it does not. We know that there are numerous moments in American history when there is vast religious discrimination. In the 1940s, for example, a number of states passed laws requiring that every school child salute the flag. You know, fine. It's patriotic, right? By the way you saluted the flag in those days is interesting. You put your hand over your heart and you say, I pledge allegiance to America, to the, you know, to the republic for which it stands, one nation. By the way, they hadn't put under God in it yet, so it was one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And then you would go like this. Actually, your palm would be up, so you'd go like, you'd put your hand up and then you'd go like this, which of course is almost the same thing as the Nazi salute. So while we're fighting the Nazis who are saluting the swastika like this, we're saluting the flag like this. Very weird, right? And one particular American faith, the Jehovah's Witnesses, refused to salute the flag because they said saluting the flag is like bowing down to an idol. And the Ten Commandments, if you ask the people down in Baton Rouge who passed the law, the Ten Commandments says you can't be forced to bow down to an idol. And they said that doing this to the flag is the same as bowing down. We will not salute the flag. The result is thousands and thousands of children all across America are expelled from public schools because they will not publicly violate their faith. Until finally, and I will quote this opinion later on, the Supreme Court steps in and says, no, you cannot do this. Okay? So that's one aspect of free speech and why it ties to religion. Now, going backwards just briefly, the first free speech fight in America was actually about religion because there was a minister in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s named Roger Williams. Roger Williams is living in Massachusetts, and he's living in land that the king gave to the Massachusetts colony. And Williams raises an interesting question. He says, what right does the king have to give land that the king doesn't own? Because as I see it, the land is owned by the Native Americans who are living here. And so if we want to, live on their land, maybe we should buy it from them. And furthermore, he says, if you look at the English flag, it has St. George's cross on it. That's part of the English flag. And he says, by what right does the king have to appropriate a symbol of Christ for his political benefit? Did Jesus Christ talk to the king and say, it's okay to use my symbol on your flag? And so he simply asks these questions. He gets kicked out of Massachusetts. He gets arrested. They throw him in jail. Everybody likes him. He's a really nice guy. He just asks provocative questions. The best evidence is that the jailers conveniently leave the jail door unlocked. And he escapes to Rhode Island. and he founds the city of Providence. Why Providence? Because it's providential that he escapes there. And Williams does something unique. He buys the land from the local Narragansett Indians, and there's never an Indian-European conflict in Rhode Island until very much later. By the way, some of you may wonder why I use that term rather than Native Americans. It's because I taught in Oklahoma for 7 years, which of course is known as Indian country. And it has more recognized tribes than any other place in the United States. And everybody I met who was a tribe member said, we're Indians. One guy said, Native Americans is what you white people call us, but we're Indians. So that's why I use the terminology. It's not out of disrespect, but I think rather it is out of respect. So these are the kind of conflicts. Williams gets kicked out, but notice that free speech is tied to freedom of religion. That's part of it. So now let's move forward. We move towards the revolution. And as we move towards the revolution, there's a great amount of free speech in the American colonies because the Americans are denouncing the King of England. They're denouncing the British government. The most important author of the period is a guy named Tom Paine. Tom Paine writes a book, Common Sense, in which he basically says it's absurd to think that a tiny island should rule a continent, i.e. England should not rule North America. If anything, it would be the other way around. And then he goes into attacking the origins of the English royal family. And of course, if you study English history, you know that a number of the English royal families got there by killing the previous king in a battle, and one family takes over from another family. It's not a really pretty picture. So he says, we don't have to obey them. During the American Revolution, a number of the states pass what they call a Bill of Rights or a Declaration of Rights. The Virginia Bill of Rights, adopted in 1776, written by George Mason, for whom there is now a college and a law school named in Virginia. George Mason says, the freedom of the press is one of the great bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. It's interesting to keep that in mind. So if you restrain the freedom of the press, if you tell the newspapers what they can and cannot say or publish, are you becoming a despotic government? So in the Constitution, they don't add the Bill of Rights. They don't have a First Amendment because the delegates say we don't need one. They say we're creating a government of limited powers. Congress can only do what's listed when you get your little Constitution. If you turn to Article 1, Section 8, it's called the Enumerated Powers, and it lists the powers of Congress. And they say, look, these are the powers of Congress. These are the things Congress can do. It doesn't say it can suppress the press. Therefore, it can't. But people who are fearful of this newly created national government say, we're not going to trust that that's how it's going to play out. We want a Bill of Rights. And so James Madison, who is famous as being the father of the Constitution, also writes as a congressman what becomes the Bill of Rights. And what turns out to be the First Amendment is the one dealing with freedom of speech and press. Now, here's a little hint. At some point in your life, you're going to encounter somebody who's going to say, it's the First Amendment because it's the most important thing. But actually, when Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, there were 12 amendments, not 10. And what is now the First Amendment was actually the Third Amendment. So he didn't put it in first. It's just that the first two didn't get ratified. So it became the first. Okay. Now, what does free speech mean for America? One of the things it means is that you are allowed to discuss what is important to the American people and to yourself. And it is not only about political issues. It's about many other issues. And free speech is not quiet, and it is not always happy. And that means that in a democracy, you have to at least tolerate people who say things that you don't like, okay? That's part of what free speech is. And one of the things that I think we as a society today have lost track of is the idea that if we believe in free speech for ourselves, we have to believe in free speech for other people with whom we disagree. And in fact, one of the tragedies of last spring is not that people were demonstrating for something they deeply believed in. I was never quite sure what it was that they deeply believed in, but they thought they knew. But that they felt that because they deeply believed in it, they had a right to prevent other people from speaking. They had a right to shut other people up. So free speech allows marches, it allows demonstrations, it allows symbolic speech, it allows Colin Kaepernick to take a knee when the Star-Spangled Banner is being played because he believes that America is a racist country and that one way of demonstrating, peaceful demonstrating, that you don't like what's going on in America is to take a knee. You shouldn't be fired from your job for peacefully expressing your political views. You could be fired if you can't throw a good touchdown pass. That's a good reason to get rid of a quarterback. It's not a good reason to get rid of a quarterback because you don't like what he believes in, as long as it is peaceful. By the way, it also means you can burn the American flag, because there's nothing more symbolic than burning the flag to get people's attention, because one purpose of free speech is to get the attention of everybody else. But what you can't do is to go to the local flagpole and cut the flag down that doesn't belong to you and burn it, because you can't steal somebody else's flag to burn it just to prove that you want to burn the flag. So there are limits to how you exercise your free speech. Free speech involves movies, it involves art, it involves theater, it involves musical lyrics. Because free speech is about ideas. Now, some people say, well, free speech should be about, political dialogue in a classroom or on, a TV program where you actually have a real debate. But lots of it is not about that. In the 1950s and 60s, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders led marches. These marches were never violent, although the police were sometimes violent at the marchers. But the marchers themselves were not violent. The marchers were peaceful. The marchers were simply saying, we want the world to know what racial segregation is like in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana, because this is important. And the way to do this is to march. By the way, the response of many southern states was for the police to attack the marchers. Famously in Birmingham, Alabama, the police literally took fire hoses, with enormous water pressure and hosed civil rights marchers. You literally, in some of the videos, see people being pushed backwards, thrown into the air by the force of the fire hose. In some ways, the police in Birmingham were the best friends the civil rights movement ever had, because the civil rights movement was saying the Deep South is violent and racist and anti-American. And guess what? They're showing it, they're proving it, they're acting that way. So one way to think about suppressing free speech is if you suppress free speech of the people you don't like, you turn your enemies into martyrs in favor of freedom of speech. You turn your enemies into the people who are the supporters of the Constitution. I want to give you an example of the language of the Supreme Court in one very important case. This is a case from 1927. It involved a woman who proclaimed to be a communist, although it's not clear that other than her theoretical views, she ever did anything about it. She actually came from a very, very, very wealthy family, and her name was Whitney. If any of you ever go to New York City, you can go to the Whitney Museum, which is one of the great museums in the United States. Her family donated their art collection and then built the museum. And in writing about her prosecution, Justice Louis Brandeis wrote, "Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state, that is the final end of the government, was to make men free." Now, he uses men in the generic term. Today, he would probably use the term human beings. He's not saying this is gendered, but rather it's humanity. Language changes over time. That's important, by the way, when you do history and when you read speeches and when you read text, that language, the way we use language changes. So he says, it is to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. That is, deliberative, we should talk about things and not merely be arbitrary. Those who won our independence valued liberty both as an end and as a means. And this is a very important concept, because liberty as a means is public discourse to change minds. But the other thing Brandeis is saying, that liberty is also an end in itself. So you should have the liberty to like the music you like the art you like. It's got nothing to do with politics. It's got to do with the notion of being a free person. And the nature of a free person is that you are free to have this liberty. So they valued liberty as both an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. That without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, and that with them, discussion offers ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine. That the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that is, a people who sit around and do nothing. That public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of American government. There's a lot packed into this. The case, if you want to read it, is Whitney versus California. If you Googled it, you could find it. Google knows everything, right? Brandeis, in his opinion, acknowledges the risks to public order of freedom of expression. But he explains that the answer to freedom of expression is not suppression or violence. The path of safety lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good counsel. In other words, the answer to bad speech is not to shut up the people you disagree with, but to have a better answer. And oftentimes, I think, do we see suppression of speech from people who don't have a better answer. The anti-civil rights governments, particularly in Alabama and Mississippi, they had no answer to segregation. They couldn't say segregation is morally right, so they could only use the police and the Ku Klux Klan, both, political authority and private authority to shut up people they disagreed with. And Brandeis goes on to say, believing in the power of reason as applied through public discussion, the framers were against silence coerced by law, the argument of force in its worst form, and recognizing the occasional tyrannies of governing majorities, they amended the Constitution so that free speech and assembly should be guaranteed. It is the function of free speech to free men from the bondage of irrational fears. So that's one other way of thinking about free speech. And yes?
In your opinion, where should legal people draw the line with kind of outlandish hate speech or vile speech?
Well, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but I'll answer it now.
You can wait.
No, it's fine. I mean, this is why we have questions. Hate speech is a really complicated question, right? Because one person's hatred is another person's love, right? Until 1967, for example, it was illegal in about 14 states for people of different races to get married. Okay. By the way, it had never been illegal in Louisiana for white men to have sex with their slave women. But marriage is different than copulation, as some of you may know. Can I say that in a Methodist school? I don't know. But the answer is that you have a constitutional right to be a jerk, as long as it only involves speaking. The law makes a distinction between speech and action. If I say, I hate you and I wish you were dead, it's very different if I have an AR-15 in my hand or if I'm standing at a podium talking. One is a threat for which the law may intervene, and the other is simply some jerk mouthing off. And so it's a fine line. But when you get a large crowd marching in Charlottesville, spouting hatred, and the crowd appears to be violent, you certainly have a legitimate reason to say that this is a moment when you have a right to say these things and we have a right to line your march with the police to make sure that your enthusiasm for being awful human beings doesn't get out of hand. And these are fine lines. These are not easy discussions. But again, by the way, in a private college campus, you have more leeway. The private college campus can say that the rules of our campus are that you must be civil. You cannot be hateful. You cannot do things that single out people on the basis of fill in the blank, race, religion, faith, ethnicity, political belief, disability, you name it, gender preference, gender pronouns. You can't do that, and we will kick you out of school if you do. So, and by the way, one of the things that comes up in free speech is that often people who favor a particular cause are told you cannot have your demonstration. The general rules on demonstrations are, the general rules on free speech are that the government has a right to regulate what's called time, place, and manner. So for instance, yeah, you can have your protest march. You can't have it at the intersection of First Street and Main Street in downtown at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and shut down all traffic in rush hour. You can't have it on the interstate because the time and place don't allow it. One of the things that Dr. King ran into is that he would go to a town and he'd say, I'd like a parade permit. And there's a rule about what a parade permit should look like, right? And King would be denied the parade permit. And then he'd say, I'm going to march anyways. Now, he knew he was going to get arrested. It's very interesting. You see him give speeches, he wears suits, he kind of dresses like I am today because, I'm the guest speaker, so I can't dress like, the rest of you. But when he knows he's going to break the law, he would show up in wearing jeans or overalls because he knows he's going to jail. But the difference, and again, this is the difference between the demonstrations, if we want to call them that, last spring, and say Dr. King. Dr. King understood, if I break the law, I will go to jail, and then I will fight the law because the law is unconstitutional. The law is taking my constitutional rights away. Whereas what you saw at some university campuses were students who say, we don't care about the law, we don't care about private property, we don't care about windows or doors or buildings. We only care about what we care about. And so we are not practicing what is called civil disobedience. So that in Greensboro, North Carolina, in the very beginning of the civil rights movement, 4 very brave students from North Carolina A&T sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter. Now you have to understand, in the 1950s and early 60s, Woolworth's was one of the largest chain stores in America. There were Woolworths everywhere, and they all had lunch counters. And they sat down at the lunch counter and demanded to be served. Woolworth's in North Carolina was not required to have us be segregated. It did it because it wanted to. And it wouldn't serve the people, and they sat there all day, and they came back the next day. And eventually they were arrested for disturbing the peace. And meanwhile, all over the country, people stopped shopping at Woolworth's, and Woolworth's got the message. And they changed in North Carolina. And that Woolworth's, by the way, is now a museum worth visiting. So you can change the law by peacefully challenging the law. But that's very different than hate speech that is designed to intimidate. You also can't intimidate people. Not all speech is legal. For example, if a cop stops me for speeding and I say, isn't there some way we can work this out? And I hand him my driver's license or hand her my driver's license and I have a $20 bill wrapped around it. When I say, isn't there some way we can work this out, that's solicitation of a bribe or an offer of a bribe. That's an offer of a bribe. That's illegal. So you can't bribe somebody. You can't threaten somebody. You can't call somebody up on the phone and say, I'm going to kill you. That's not free speech. That's a criminal act in and of itself. On the other hand, and this is really worth noting, that you can't suppress people just because you don't like what they have to say. I'm going to give you a very modern example of it. In the 1970s, there was an organization called the American Nazi Party. You can all guess what the Nazi Party stands for. Basically hatred. Hatred of lots of people. Blacks, Jews, immigrants, gay people, lots of people. They're equal opportunity haters. They believe in it for everybody who's not like them. They wanted to march in a town called Skokie, Illinois, which happened to have a very large number of Holocaust survivors living there. And they wanted to march there because that would give them lots of publicity and that could make them truly annoying and obnoxious. And the Skokie City Council, in one of the stupidest moves of a local government, passed a law which required that in order to have a march, you had to put up a very large cash bond to prevent any damage to the city. And basically what this law did was to prevent a peaceful march. By the way, the first group that was unable to march in Skokie was the Jewish war veterans on Veterans Day because they couldn't afford to post the bond either, right? The Nazis then spent 2 years litigating this. They ultimately won, and then they never went to Skokie. They didn't actually want to go there. They wanted to, but they spent 2 years saying, we are defending the right of free speech, and those people are attacking free speech. While they were there, I'm going to tell you 2 quick stories, and then we will open it up to questions. We end about 10 after the hour, is that right? Okay, so I was living in St. Louis at the time that this took place, and the Nazis came to St. Louis and they said, we'd like to march in St. Louis. Mayor of St. Louis was much smarter than the Skokie City Council. He said, sure, we'll allow anybody to march in St. Louis. And they said, and we want to march in this German neighborhood. They didn't understand that the Germans in St. Louis came in 1848, not 1948. They were not ex-Nazis. They were longtime American patriots, right? In fact, most of the properly aged adult men in that community had fought in World War II, many against the Nazis, right? Fine, you can march in that neighborhood. And they said, we want police protection. No problem. We'll get you 100 cops, lots of police protection. Mayor of St. Louis, really great guy, really understands politics. He had 100 African-American policemen with billy clubs and guns and badges protecting the Nazis who were marching in a neighborhood where everybody is out there throwing rocks and snowballs at them. Now, they were yelling, commies go home. Obviously, there are politics in the neighborhood. They didn't take a correct political science course to know the right from the left. But you get the picture. The Nazis showed up in the back of what was literally a dump truck, and they were afraid to get out of their truck. So these guys are in a dump truck driving through a neighborhood protected by 100 black cops and having stones thrown at them. So one answer to speech that you don't like is not to suppress it. It is to mock it. It is to make fun of it. What the people of Skokie should have done was say, of course you have a right to march in our city. We will give you the parade permit. And then they should have organized 10,000 people to stand on the parade grounds with their backs to the march. And the news would show these Nazis marching in a city with 10,000 people standing like this with the march going that way. And that would have mocked them and made fun of them and exposed them to what they are. I'm going to give you one more very quick story about this kind of behavior, and then I'll take some questions if there are any. And the one story involves President Theodore Roosevelt. And before he was president, Theodore Roosevelt was the police commissioner of the city of New York. And in 1895, a professional anti-Semite, somebody who hated Jews, who was a German member of the German parliament, and who was a minister, obviously very, very religious man because he spent his life hating other people. He came to New York to give some speeches, and he said he wanted police protection, and Roosevelt said, no problem at all. And so he would stand there and give a speech, and there'd be, like 25 cops with probably names on their badges, Their names were Cohen and Levy and Rosenbaum and Goldberg. They were all Jews, right? And at the end of the talk, he thanked Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, wouldn't you like to meet the police who've been, guarding you? He said, yes, they are great specimens of Aryan manhood. And then he had to shake hands with all these Jewish cops. That's the other way to deal with speech that you dislike. It's the symbolic speech. The answer to bad speech is good speech. Thank you. Questions? Any questions? No questions? Yes, in the back. You, yes.
Do you have anything to say about the paradox of tolerance?
The paradox of what?
Tolerance.
How do you mean define your term? Speak.
To protect free speech, you must limit speech that would go against free speech.
No, I don't think that's a paradox. I mean, in other words, I think it's perfectly okay for somebody to give a speech or write a book saying that we shouldn't have free speech. Okay? That's part of free speech. I had a friend who was a medieval historian who taught a course on the medieval Catholic Church. This was before the Protestant Reformation, obviously, which spent a great deal of its energy suppressing free speech. This was their theological ideology. So I don't think it's a paradox. I think the answer is that alternatively, if you say, well, if you're against free speech, we don't want to hear you, that means you're the person who's against free speech. But by the way, in American history, the greatest attack on free speech was against people who opposed slavery, abolitionists. And Congress, for example, spent a decade refusing to accept petitions from anti-slavery organizations saying you should do something about slavery in the territories or repeal the fugitive slave law. The end result was the abolitionists, who were a very small minority and were seen as kind of kooky troublemakers, like, why are you people in Boston worried about what they do in Charleston or in New Orleans? Only worry about your neighborhood. They then went around collecting petitions in favor of free speech and the right to petition, peacefully petition the government for redress of grievances. And so the end result is that the abolitionists became the most important supporters of free speech, and they got lots and lots of people to agree with them or at least support them or listen to their arguments. And by the way, the South did itself no favors because it didn't have any dialogue. It didn't have any conversation. It was illegal to own an anti-slavery newspaper. You could go to jail in Louisiana or Mississippi or Virginia. The most powerful book ever written in America, if there's anybody in the English department here, the most important novel ever written in the English language is Uncle Tom's Cabin. And you couldn't read it in the South unless you were like a newspaper editor who was going to write a scathing review, but you couldn't buy it. Everywhere else in the world you could buy it. It's translated into a whole bunch of languages. You can't read it here. So one of the tragedies of the American Civil War is that Southerners had no conversation with the North. And so they really didn't understand what they were getting into when they decided to make war on their own country, which is why the parts of the South to this day are still recovering from the Civil War. There is a reason that Mississippi is the poorest state in the country. It's because it brought on its own destruction. And by the way, when you think about General Sherman marching from Vicksburg to the Atlantic coast, just keep in mind that the march of General Sherman liberates more human beings from bondage and oppression than ever happens in the world until the Allies march on Berlin in 1944 and 1945. Questions? Mother question? Yeah, your hand, yes. You already got one question. I'm cool.
In an increasingly politically polarizing culture and society, how do we open up the dialogue? I feel like we've lost in our culture and even our government the art of the compromise. Do you know what I mean?
We have. And by the way, if I could answer that, I could be president. Or I could at least, I could run for Congress or something. I think we begin to do it on the personal level. And we begin to do it at family dinners. We begin to do it in dormitories. We begin to say, okay, you're here and I'm here, and we violently disagree on X, Y, and Z. Let's figure out what we might agree on. And let's talk about it in a setting where you won't interrupt me, and I'll speak for 3 minutes, and then you can speak for 3 minutes or something. Let's actually have a dialogue. You know, the debate the other night was not a dialogue. It was not even a debate. It was something else. It was political performance. It was very useful. You know, you got to see something about the people running for president. But I think the dialogue has to begin in your dormitory and in your family and with your neighbors. And you have to talk. And that's really hard. But it has to start with saying, look, no name calling, no finger pointing, and if you're going to make a claim, try to back that up with evidence. You know, don't make a claim and then when maybe the third-party moderator, you know, like your grandmother, says, well, you know, no, actually the police and the city manager of Springfield, Ohio, say that nobody has eaten any cats. Don't say, well, what would you expect them to say? You know, you gotta actually deal with facts, and that's a problem. But I think you'd try to do it in a non-confrontational way, and it's not easy. I will tell you all this. As a historian, I know that things change over time and that we will get through this. This is not the worst crisis in American history. The worst crisis in American history began at Fort Sumter in the spring of 1861. And 650,000, more or less, mostly overwhelmingly young American men died on both sides of that war. That was, you know, that was a crisis. In the 1850s, a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, gave a speech attacking the pro-slavery position of trying to turn the Kansas Territory into a slave state. And the speech was called The Crime of Kansas. The next day, a congressman from South Carolina approached Sumner. He's sitting at a desk, and it's one of these desks where you sit on the chair and then the desk part comes over your head, so you're trapped inside your desk. And Congressman from South Carolina snuck up behind Sumner and started beating him on the head with a cane, while two other Southern congressmen pulled revolvers to prevent anybody from protecting. Nobody's duking it out with Mitch McConnell. You know, I'd love to see that boxing match. No, I wouldn't. We don't want that. You know, but you know, and one of the other things is, and maybe we're probably out of time, right? So I'll leave it with this. One of the other things is we all have to learn how to deal with a world where we are confronted by the media 24 hours a day. And we no longer have the kind of notion that newscasters are going to give you the facts as they understand them, rather than the political ideology that they want you to learn. There are some sources that are much better than others, but nevertheless, we're constantly facing, you know, this barrage of media, barrage of internet, and it's constant, and there's a value if you're the newscaster in saying something outrageous because somebody will watch your show. And so, you know, we have, you know, on one hand, cat-eating immigrants, and on the other hand, we have the most dangerous people in America today are childless women who own cats. So all of you who are women who own cats, be careful, because you are threatening the very moral fiber of Western civilization. Thank you.